Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today's event is brought to you by the York Environmental Sustainability Institute, and we're based at the University of York. Our aim is to facilitate and deliver world-class interdisciplinary research on environmental sustainability for the research community, industry, and policymakers. We focus on three research areas: sustainable food, led by Professor Bob Doherty, resilient ecosystems, led by Professor Jane Hill, and urban living, led by Professor Alistair Boxall. As well as supporting and developing the development of bid proposals, YESI regularly holds events to showcase research, encourage discussion, and raise awareness of global challenges to a variety of audiences. The Ask the Author event series is YESI's latest initiative designed to provide the general public with an opportunity to ask researchers about their work. Today, we'd like to welcome Dr. Colin Beale, who's based in the Department of Biology, and he'll be talking to us today about his paper on African elephant poaching rates. Welcome, Colin.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Good. So thank you for asking me to chat through our paper today. This is a collaboration with a lot of people who I'm going to thank at the end. But I've not done one of these yet in exactly this way. I'll try and talk you through the key points of the paper, and then I'll be very happy to answer any questions we've got later. So African elephants are an iconic species that everyone loves. Really, I've yet to meet anyone who doesn't. And I spend a lot of time in East Africa, where I'm privileged enough to see elephants lots of the time. Most of my work is on savannas and savanna ecology, but there's such a crisis taking place in poaching related things that I've been dragged into some of this elephant work by colleagues and friends out there. And so what we're talking through is a paper that we produced last year that is an overview of the scale and threats that elephants face in Africa at the moment. You may have seen things in the news a few years ago. There's a big campaign that said 1 every 15 minutes. And that was saying that the rate of elephant poaching at the time is every 15 minutes one goes. So by the time I finish talking and start asking your questions, another elephant will have been poached on average. You may have seen pictures of Ivory burns. This one was in Nairobi, again, just sort of 3 years ago, but ongoing. It's been a really high profile story. And some of my own work in Africa, in Tanzania mostly, shows quite how densely the intensity of this poaching is taking place. This is a map of a protected area in southwest Tanzania. And every one of those crosses is where an aerial survey has taken place and found a carcass. And we've modeled those things across the national park on the bottom side and a set of game reserves elsewhere. The flight lines are the lines that you can see coming along here. So the airplane comes along and then they've seen carcasses here, or they've gone up this way and they've seen carcasses as they go along. It's been a huge issue in a lot of conservation in the last little while. So I set out to say, well, okay, we know locally it can be a real problem, but across the whole continent, is it as bad as people are making out? I'm a scientist, I work at a university, I value my independence very strongly, and a lot of the campaigns around these things are definitely from people with a vested interest in putting over one side or another. So my first question is it really that bad? And if it is, then what interventions are there that are taking place that could help solve some of these problems? So if you think about poaching as a pipeline, we've got live elephants in the field, and this is the only dead elephant I'm going to give you because I much prefer looking at the live ones. But at some point there's a poaching event and that elephant is killed. It's then processed such that its tusk in country, wherever it has been, is removed and is shipped, and it has to get across a border most of the time and then ultimately to market that is, although sometimes in Africa, a lot of it is not. The big markets for illegal ivory are all in Asia. So interventions could take place at any way along this pipeline, but obviously what we want to achieve is keeping live elephants. We want to intervene ideally before they become dead elephants. So there are interventions that can be done all the way along. A lot of work on developing alternative livelihoods for poachers, or just making sure that people think this is a bad idea, right through to, at the other end, looking at money laundering. Any of these interventions could slow the pipeline, but which ones are most effective? That's what we set out to try and achieve in this paper. See if we could balance up some of the costs and benefits of the different types of things. So to do this, we had to start with some data, obviously. And CITES is the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. It runs a program called MIKE, which is monitoring the illegal killing of elephants. And they work in 53 sites across Africa. All of the little protected areas in here, communities, and arranging in those sites to monitor on an annual basis every dead elephant that is found by rangers in those fields. They find the carcass, they will go and look at it and decide, yes, this was illegally killed, or no, this is a natural carcass. And they've been doing this for quite a long time now. So we've got a time series from the biggest elephant populations across Africa. About 80% of all the elephants live in these areas. And we can see there's considerable variation. So the darker colors in these things are the proportion of illegally killed ones, whereas these ones are carcasses that are not illegally killed. We were just looking at data from Ruaha, which is this site in southern Tanzania, and we can see that nearly 3/4 of all carcasses that have been found in Ruaha are illegally killed, whereas the other ones are not there. But it's very variable between places and between countries as well. So Tarangire, also in Tanzania, only just over half of them are illegally killed. We also needed to match the elephant data with a whole set of other information about the interventions that are taking place both locally and nationally. So we've got a set of data we collated on site level information about things like the poverty in the local area. So if we think that interventions related to giving people alternative livelihoods such that they don't have to go poaching might work, we want to see that poverty related to the local rates of poaching. So we had information on infant mortality, which is a very good indicator of local poverty, as well as an index of poverty density, which is the density of people living within 30 kilometers of these protected areas who earn less than $1 a day. And then we had information from the rangers about the adequacy of law enforcement in their area. They were trained and then asked to give a score from 1 to 5 of how adequate it is. And the area, the protected area, its size, whether it's really big or really small. At a country level, we collated information on corruption. Transparency International goes out every year and asks people about their experience of corruption, whether they've been asked to pay bribes, whether they have paid bribes, across the entire world. So we have a global data set on a country level each year of how much corruption there is in each country. And then the key variable relating to demand that we used was ivory price. But because we can't very well monitor the illegal ivory price, we used mammoth ivory. Mammoths obviously extinct these days, but there's a huge market for mammoth ivory that is legally traded. It's dug almost in mines in Siberia and shipped to the same warehouses and workshops that work elephant ivory. And we know that occasionally the workshops will pass mammoth ivory off as elephant ivory because there's a premium on the price for elephant ivory. So it's the same places, the same people. We think that there's a good correlation between mammoth ivory price and the black market price of elephant ivory. So we're monitoring all of those things. And the first thing we wanted to do was check whether our model is any good and see what the broad picture was across the landscape. So the data we have available start in 2002 and at the time finished in 2017. So they have continued gathering these and we're still working with the MIC program to monitor these things. And we used the information from the first part of the years, from 2002 to 2014, to build a model, and then we predicted what should happen in the last 4 years of the data set. So these blue boxes and the grey lines are our modelled predictions over time, and the pink ones are the predictions into the future that were not using those data. We find a very good match between the grey lines, which are the overall results going forward, and our predictions. So we're quite confident that things are happening. You see there's a very large peak in 2011. This is the annual poaching rate. So that is the proportion of elephants in the population as a whole across these 53 sites across Africa, probably most of the elephants, that would expect to be killed in any 1 year. So in 2011, nearly 10%, 0.1 of all African elephants were poached. It has very happily declined consistently since then. Now, the last information we have, it's around about 2 to 3% that is taking place. So it's continued on downwards. We also try to verify our model by looking internally within the data set much more at the annual and site level variation. We found a pretty good match internally as well as on this sort of external validation here. So we're quite confident that our model matches the patterns in the raw data very well, and it tells us about these broad peaks and declines. So the question then is why? Why do we see so much site variation and annual variation? And our model, we turned it into a predictive model and said, okay, if we took the value that corresponds to the best case scenario for any country or site in Africa, and if everywhere else matched that, what would be the poaching rate across Africa if we did that? So if we do nothing, make no interventions, that's what we were just looking at. And the average poaching rate at the peak of this poaching was around about 6% for the years either side of that very big peak. If we switched corruption perception, so if everywhere became as clean as Botswana, which is the cleanest country according to Transparency International in Africa, we would have seen a poaching rate decline to less than 0.01, so about 1% of African elephants. That would be the most effective intervention we do, is clean up corruption across the whole of Africa to match what is achieved in Botswana. But the next strongest effect was the mammoth ivory price. And here, if we assume that in the year with the lowest ivory price, which was actually at right at the start of that time series, if everywhere had stayed there, we would only have seen about 2%. So you can see how we can rank order those different interventions and work out how effective they are at bringing down the levels of poaching that's going on. So corruption perception is the most important. Ivory price, that's a measure of demand, is probably the next strongest. But law enforcement, which is putting rangers on the ground and working in the park, although it's closest to the event itself, is actually only a middle ranking activity. Now, that's not to say that if we stopped all law enforcement, there wouldn't be massive poaching. Rather, I think that everywhere has a basic level of law enforcement already, or everywhere that still has elephants has a certain basic level of law enforcement, and the value of improving and increasing that is marginal compared to the deterrent effect it has at the moment. So, so we do need to bear those sorts of things in mind. Poverty is also right there in the top. So that density of poverty is an important predictor of African elephant poaching rate. So before I hand back to you and take your questions, this is that timeline we saw. We aim to keep elephants alive at the beginning. And we saw that actually the biggest effects are on this demand side, demand reduction at this end, and the anti-poverty, the corruption activities. So dealing with the judiciary and law enforcement. Now, the UK funds an entire set of grants related to illegal activities through UK aid. It's called the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund. And I just thought, well, since what's affecting elephants most is this corruption and poverty is a really big driver, but also demand reduction, do we see that's where people are spending these money? At the moment, it looks as though all of the money, or nearly half of the UK aid, is going to enforcement, which is one of the moderate interventions. A little bit of livelihoods, very, very little on demand management, and very little on law enforcement. So these types of activities that we think are most effective are not where we're spending money at the moment. That's that little reminder. So corruption, perception, demand associated things, and poverty related things are not in the top of here at all. So my take-home messages are that elephant poaching in 2011 in particular and around then was absolutely terrible, but happily things have got better since then. Corruption enables this process and demand drives things in the first place, but that's not where we're spending our money at the moment. And I would like, if there's one thing you take home, I think the interventions that we make to reduce elephant poaching need to consider the global justice of this pipeline. We need to be thinking about who is driving demand and targeting our interventions to reduce demand and essentially punish the people who are making most money from this, rather than the poor Africans who are actually suffering the costs of having elephants there. And having elephants in your neighborhood is a real cost. People die from elephants every single year. And that's where I'm just going to say thank you to you for listening, and to my co-authors, particularly Severin, who's been a brilliant PhD student working on this, and Regresh and Julian and Carsten for all of their thing, but also all the rangers who actually put their lives out in danger on a day-to-day basis in front of poaching to try and stop that and make sure that we can all see elephants for the future. Any questions? I think you can ask them via the question and answer feature in Zoom, and I'm hoping that Jane will be able to pass them on to me and I can answer them.
While we just wait for people to write any questions down, I was wondering if you see any correlation between climate events, droughts and that sort of thing, and does this reflect on poaching rates? I mean, I presume it does, but is there evidence of that?
We do see differences in the proportions of carcasses that are natural versus illegally killed. During droughts, particularly young elephants, and sometimes the very old, but usually the young ones die. So there's a lot more carcasses around, and the proportion of illegally killed ones drops. But so it was actually really important for us to account for rainfall and drought-related effects where we did this model. It doesn't seem to change the poaching itself. It changes the sort of background rate of death for elephants.
So it doesn't have a knock-on effect on poverty rates, which then increases poaching rates.
So we haven't noticed it at that fine a scale. The temporal variation, the year-to-year variation, is almost entirely driven by the demand, the price of ivory in Asia. The site level variation is the bit that's driven by the combination of corruption in the country and poverty locally. So if you're in a poor corner of a country, there's more poaching in that corner than there is in a richer corner as well.
And you mentioned Botswana having very low rates. Are there specific reasons why that happens there?
So Botswana is well known for having one of the most transparent and uncorrupted government systems in Africa. It actually scores higher than, well, certainly than the UK, but than most of the West in these things. It's the way they've governed themselves and decided to go. So it's absolutely doable. People can clean up their acts and become less corrupt. And there are interventions that we know. So one of the positives I find from this message is that conservation aimed at protecting elephants is really well tied to anti-corruption and anti-poverty interventions in general. And we have much more common ground with people who seek to work to do those. And that's a great thing for everyone in the countries where these live. We want less poverty, we want less corruption. And if that also means more elephants, then that keeps me very happy.
That's some good news then.
Yeah.
I've got a question here from Caroline Ward asking, how does your model deal with country contextual factors, such as what if the countries with lowest corruption levels or any other factor you include also happen to have other factors that affect the poaching level that might not be incorporated in the model?
So I don't want to go too much into the sort of technical side of the statistical analysis, because it was a rather complicated one, but there is a country level effect that essentially tries to soak up all of those unexplained variation between countries, and that's quite large. So there are large country level effects that we can't explain, but the main bit of it that we do explain is this corruption level and the other covariates at the site level. So there are unexplained processes affecting or making different patterns between countries, but we're accounting for that in our statistical model. I'm happy to talk to someone about those details if they want at another point, because it's quite a sophisticated and technical discussion involved in the analysis.
And does that answer your question, Caroline?
I just, as a quick follow-up to that, I wondered if Colin had any sort of hypotheses or ideas about what those unexplained things that are happening in some of the countries, any idea on what those might be?
So there are some things that we didn't include that are definitely in there. So there's a big difference between forested areas and unforested areas in general. Partly because the detection process is very different in a forest. So in forests, almost all the carcasses we find are illegally killed, but that's because rangers listen out for gunshots, and it's the only way they find carcasses. In savannas, you're much more likely to see evidence of scavengers saying there's a carcass somewhere. You'll go and see what's there and find that there's been a poaching incident or that there's a natural carcass. So some of that is differences on a much larger ecological scale. Some of it, I think, is to do with cultural differences. Africa is an entire continent that is far more diverse culturally than anywhere else the rest of the world. Interactions with the environment. And then there's effects of population density per se, I'm sure, going on at the country level, and the ease of access to the elephants in different countries.
Thank you. I've got another question from Rob Marchant. He said it was a very interesting study. As it came about last year, has this been communicated back to those that have a role in managing PA, elephant conservation, etc.? And do you see any traction with the governments that have been named and shamed?
Well, we certainly didn't explicitly name and shame governments. That was never a plan for us. But the paper itself was taken to the CITES Conference of the Parties, which happened at the end of last year. In the end, it was due to happen earlier, obviously, but they were interrupted and they had to reschedule. So the paper was part of CITES management teams and the MIC program's response and documentation at the CITES convention of the parties last year, which feeds directly into the conservation of all of those countries. And elephant trade was very much on the agenda at that meeting. There were proposals to legalize trade, counter proposals to maintain or actually completely ban forever all trade in ivory. This paper was part of those discussions. A number of different governments have picked up on it. So I know the Botswana government is quite keen on it, as you might imagine, and other places are aware of them. My colleagues in Tanzania, which was where the peak was in 2011, but has actually done an awful lot better since then, have been engaged and discussing things with government behind the scenes, as well as more publicly. So it has reached different places, and I hope that's important. In the UK, I have spoken with people involved in the Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund on an informal basis, and they're very keen to have more projects to support in the areas that we've suggested, but they obviously respond to the grants that people make, the applications people make.
Does that answer your question, Rob? You have any come back?
It's gone.
No.
Sorry, that might be me and him trying to do the same thing at one time. I can't unmute him at the moment, but Rob, your talking is permitted now. There you go.
Muted myself. No, that was really good and great to hear that it's got traction on these various stages from national to international. No, really good. I'm going to drop off now because I've got another call at 1, but yeah, good to see.
Good.
Thank you. And I've got a question from Jane Hill asking two things. How can demand for ivory be reduced, and what might be targeted and be most effective?
So I think there are some interesting actions taking place in China where organizations such as Wild Aid and Traffic have started campaigns on raising awareness of the ivory trade and how it affects elephants. So to begin with, a lot of people in China didn't realize elephants even died to produce ivory. They thought their teeth fell out, much like our children's teeth do. And elephant teeth do fall out, but the tusks don't. So there's an awareness raising campaign. There's also been quite strong political activity, and obviously the ban in the trade of ivory internally within China came into place a few years ago and has been a really important signal sent there. But I'm quite interested in working with some of those organizations that are running campaigns to work out which ones are successful at raising awareness, which ones actually change behavior, and how that feeds it through to to ivory demand and price as we measure it. It's quite hard to say whether the drop in demand at the moment is a consequence of a downturn in economic conditions among the super wealthy in China, or whether it's actually a positive response to the changes that and the signals that the Chinese government have made. It'd be nice to know what really works.
Do you have anything else you want to ask, Jane?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jane. Yeah, thanks, Colin. Can I just ask a little bit more then about what people use the ivory for, and whether there are certain uses that might be more easy to tackle than the others in terms of being effective in reducing demand?
So it is all used for carved goods. A surprisingly large amount of it turns into just ivory chopsticks and plain bangles. The big quality pieces are absolute works of art. The large lumps of ivory are carved in one of 5 different workshops to make trinkets, but incredibly beautiful works of art. And people are trying to substitute that with other material. I really struggle with this whole issue, because in some ways it is possible to have a sustainable harvest of ivory. You know, elephants do die, and when they die, their tusks are there ready for collecting, just as you can collect ivory from mammoth tusks, and you're not killing any mammoths at the moment. And it seems to me that there are very real costs involved in having elephants if you're an African. I don't really see a trade ban as the answer here. I think that we need to be able to say, well, this elephant definitely died of natural causes, and then trace its ivory through to the consumer and make sure that more of the money ends up in Africa than does at the moment. At the moment, it's about $200 a kilo of ivory in Africa on the black market. The final products could be $30,000 in China when they're carved. So all the value is happening in China at the moment, and all the cost is borne in Africa. If we could rebalance that and use some sorts of new technology, I think that there are DNA markers within ivory that would allow us to track and trace, there's a phrase, from individual known cause of death to final product. The technology exists and the value is in that chain, that we might be able to do something like that, rather than just say, let's stop it all. Because yeah, I think that there's an injustice involved in saying, Africans, you've got to live with elephants, but you can't take anything other than photos unless it's, anyway, that's my personal view at the moment. I don't know if that helps answer the question or confuses it more.
No, that's great. Thanks, Colin.
Could I ask, is there a sustainability mark or anything around ivory at the moment, like there are for other products?
No, at the moment, all international trade in ivory is completely illegal. There are internal national markets in quite a few countries still. The UK has obviously enacted its own ban on an internal trade only in the last couple of years, and that was quite controversial because of the sort of antique market, but also because of this sustainable use idea in general. China banned its internal markets just a few years ago as a response to ivory trade, and that has definitely had a big impact. But there are still many countries where internal trade is entirely legal. Quite a lot of Africa does, and a lot of traditional African art involves ivory. But there is no sustainability stamp at the moment. And as far as we know, all ivory currently on the market, apart from the mammoth ivory, which can be labelled as such, is illegally traded. There are hundreds of tons of ivory sitting in warehouses in Africa. So that fire that I showed you in the first slide in Kenya was Kenya burning around about 20% of its stocks as a very public message saying we don't want to sell this afterwards. There was originally, so anytime ivory is seized at the border, it goes into a warehouse, or if rangers find a carcass that has died naturally, they'll remove the ivory and that goes into these secure warehouses. And there have been one-off sales since the general ban on ivory in 1989. That was when the first ban on the international trade in ivory came in. Then a one-off sale of stockpiles of ivory that was permitted by CITES a few years ago now to China and Japan as a sort of test to see whether it caused further problems. It definitely enabled the laundering of illegally traded ivory to take place because it wasn't very well tracked and followed at that point. There's a lot of change in the physical thing that is a lump of ivory from its raw product to its final finished bracelet, if you want that. So it's very hard to say, well, this one definitely comes from this tusk. Although, as I say, I think now we do have cheap enough DNA sampling techniques that we could do that. If you're prepared to scratch a bit of ivory out of the inside of your trinket, we can say, yes, this definitely belonged to this elephant. And if we were to have a secure database, and there are technological fixes for that, you could track individual elephants, their cause of death, and then the ivory through the value chain to the end product. I think it's doable now if that's what people wanted to do, but it hasn't been tried. And as I say, at the moment, all trade on ivory internationally is banned, and the public view in the West is very much against ivory. It's an easy thing to say, no, there shouldn't be any trade in ivory. We don't want to kill elephants. But it might be that you don't have to kill elephants to have that trade, and it might be that there's issues of justice there that are being ignored in that fairly simplified debate. But it's certainly an easy thing for people to say.
I'm just going to ask if anyone's got any final questions. I had one final thing I'd like to ask. You mentioned in your presentation that UK aid, money that comes into Africa from the UK largely goes to enforcement. Has there been any move for that to change, for it to go to areas that are actually more effective?
So, as I say, that all UK aid, that is UK aid flagged under one particular grant scheme. I should say that first. Most money doesn't go anywhere near conservation of any sort. I have spoken with some of the people who are on the panel assessing those grants since we produced this work. They say they're very interested in those results, and they're very keen on funding more work in the demand management area and in the anti-corruption area. But they can only respond to the grants that people submit to them. And I think that they're playing a bit both ways, because it's very hard to produce a grant that meets all the criteria that is focused on demand management. It's very much harder for someone to say, well, this demand is saving 20,000 elephants in Africa. That chain is really long. So if you require your grant giving agency to pin down exactly where those elephants are going to be saved, so that people can validate your claims, effectively you can't fund it. So I think they do need a structural change to the way they make those calls. And that's beyond their scope at the moment, but they are aware of these results and say they're interested in it.
And are you positive for the future that there will continue to be improvement?
And so I think that I've never been as pessimistic about elephant conservation as a lot of people, and I think that those estimates that you saw of 1 every 15 minutes, the extrapolation that people have said, well, there won't be any elephants left by 2026 at that rate, and that's that's never been my view. I think that there are some very well protected elephant populations in Africa. We're going to have elephants in those places for a long time, and it would be a terrible shame if elephants were restricted to just those few areas. And I think I'm interested to see what the future is for demand and whether there can be a sustainable use. I think my feeling at the moment is very pessimistic about sustainable use, just because there are so many people who will go with a very simple, it's much safer to say we should never trade these things than a more sophisticated answer. And the public feel very, very strongly in the UK about elephant poaching and ivory trade without necessarily being fully informed on it. So I'm very pessimistic about that. I'm much more optimistic about the long-term chances of elephants surviving in Africa than many people. I would like to see them survive in more places, and I think at the moment our model and the data we're getting from recent years suggests that at the moment the poaching rate is more or less balancing what is the population growth rate in African elephants. So it's a stable thing. If we could reduce poaching, we'd see more elephants, and that would be a good thing. If we keep poaching at the rate it is at the moment, we'll probably lose some of the smaller populations, but overall the populations, there will still be elephants. That's my feeling for the long term.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much. I thought it was a fascinating talk. It will be put up on YouTube, so people will be able to access it there. And keep watching the YESI website for future events. And thank you very much.
You're welcome.